Where did the idea of Bridge Detroit come from? This is kind of a long story. I'll try to make it short. We started Bridge Detroit with that specific idea of serving Detroiters directly, and not just serving them in a way that would get them to read or interact with our content, but to start with them, what's going on in your community, what's going on in your neighborhood, what's going on in your life, and then build our newsroom around what we heard from Detroiters and to keep that going over time.
I was in corporate communications and had been away from community journalism for a few years. And, once you do that kind of work, you always miss it. It's always in your heart.
When Bridge Detroit started, I was coming off of a fellowship somewhere else, but I had a chat with Stephen and I learned a lot about the mission in terms of having people who lived here do the work and ask questions in terms of reporting about the same questions that my neighbors were having. So just the mission itself really drove me to work for Bridge Detroit.
My first week starting at Bridge Detroit, by that Friday, the governor had shut the state down. And I think within that same week, or maybe at the top of the following week, I can't remember, I get the dates mixed up. My good friend and mentor, Marlo Stoudemire, passed away. And then I became very ill. And so the first week, or the first month of my employment at Bridge Detroit, I was sick, fighting for my life.
It was, I think, the health challenges and the inequities Detroit was dealing with during the pandemic that just made me, say to myself, if we're all gonna die, I wanna die doing community news.
What first led me to Bridge Detroit, I was reporting in Grand Rapids at the time. I was ready to come back home. It was the early days of the pandemic. I knew I wanted to do something for my city. And Stephen Henderson called me. I didn't even know he knew who I was, but he called me and said, hey, we're putting this thing together, something that is for Detroiters by Detroiters. And I wanted to play it cool, but I was basically in once he said that.
I first noticed it when it was launched. I knew it was coming. I saw the announcement of it. And I actually, even back then, I was really interested in the work because I had covered the city for a long time, and I always felt like there needed to be a more intentional effort to connect with the people you were hoping to serve.
What attracted me to Bridge Detroit was that it was a local news organization, really in the truest sense of the word.
About 2 weeks after we launched, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and of course, the summer of Black Lives Matter kind of exploded in Detroit in a different way than it did in other places. Our reporters were up close covering that, of course, because so many Detroiters were involved.
I think in 2020, it was a time of tension, and people were looking for the hard news facts. We didn't want any more fluff news. We didn't want anything that made people feel good. We wanted to know the truth. We wanted to know what was happening on the ground, how it was happening, and people wanted answers.
When we started out, we set out to create a newsroom that was demographically reflective of the city of Detroit, and that would be hyperlocal. Right? We would cover Detroit. We would cover Detroit's neighborhoods. So what that meant was that the newsroom would be majority Black. It would be run by a Black woman. It would be, a newsroom that consisted of folks of Latinx heritage and the Muslim religion, right? And I was really, really proud of that when we got started, right? We're Black run. We're Black woman led. And at the time, that in a majority Black city was an anomaly. Nobody was talking the way we were talking, and it felt really good.
There weren't other newsrooms in the city that had a lot of Black and brown voices and people making sure that we were framing these discussions the appropriate way.
I think that has been an eternal gap in the media market is, we're not hearing from the voices that are most impacted by the headlines, the decisions that we see in some of the more mainstream press.
I think Bridge Detroit is different because We actually live here. We have the same questions that you have about what's going on. You know, it's the same stakes for us. Anything that affects any other resident in the city affects me too. It affects my family. So I have the same concerns that you have.
So I joined BridgeDetroit in 2022, and one thing that made me really want to be here was knowing that everything provided by the outlet was free. It was accessible to the community without a paywall, and you knew the audience you're serving is actually people within the city, not people more broadly throughout the state who might not connect with the news that you're trying to deliver.
We knew we had something special from the very beginning. And what happened, what ensued is I witnessed Detroit embrace us day by day, month by month, year by year, and begin to look to us to be the voice that they needed us to be.
I started at BridgeDetroit as a freelancer in 2022. I wrote a couple of art stories for them, and then a few months later, I was hired full-time to cover arts and education. And the editor at the time, Catherine Kelly, she was saying that arts and culture and education were two areas Detroiters really wanted to see more of. So I'm happy I'm able to fill that need.
In the next 5 years, by our 10th birthday, I really want to see BridgeDetroit continue a lot of the things we're doing, continue the community engagement, continue having conversations that are framed around what's in the best interest of community members.
You know, I would love to see us even more deeply involved in Detroiters' lives.
I would love to see BridgeDetroit establish an endowment. Funding community news is always a challenge, and to have some sustainable resource to support coverage, archiving, and the overall news gathering efforts would be an amazing accomplishment.
I hope by our 10th birthday, we are a stronger organization. I think we need more reporters. I want more younger people who are working for us. I want us to create some pipelines into local schools here so that people in Detroit can grow up thinking that, knowing that they can have a career in journalism.
I would like to be able to walk into any store, any restaurant in the city and talk about BridgeDetroit, and everyone in that space knows what BridgeDetroit is. I hope that they have more questions for us. I hope that people pitch us more stories. I want to be able to go into a space and not have to explain what BridgeDetroit is. I want people to already know and say, I love reading your work.
How would you sum up BridgeDetroit's first 5 years in one sentence?
I think BridgeDetroit is leading the way in how to engage the community and tell its stories.
BridgeDetroit has filled a huge void in the news landscape in the city of Detroit and serves its residents every day.
BridgeDetroit's first 5 years have set the foundation for more robust journalism in Detroit.
BridgeDetroit's first 5 years demonstrated a level of resilience and commitment to Detroiters.
Doing the damn thing. Can I say that? Okay, we're doing the damn thing. That's it.